The Senate Judiciary Committee examined steps that could reform police departments across the U.S. Lawmakers held a hearing on the issue Tuesday. They discussed police use of force, community relations, and qualified immunity, which protects officers from being sued over actions they take in the field.
And here's what I worry about the most. It is hard to be a cop. Let's make sure that we don't destroy the ability to be a cop in the process of trying to fix things that need to be fixed. Qualified immunity is an intriguing idea to me. I don't want the cop to lose their house, but I do want people to have to think twice if they've got a police force about how to organize it and how to train it. Because that's when change will happen. It's when people feel the sting of bad policies. So to the extent that any of you on this side, on my Democratic colleagues, want to get there, count me in. There are a bunch of us who would like to get there. And if we get there, it'll be together.
And so I worry in this moment, I really do, that we're going to repeat history, that this is the movie Groundhog Day. Talks of, again, a so-called reform packages, more studies, more nibbling around the edges, as opposed to acting boldly and doing the things that we actually know will hold police officers accountable for their conduct, which will set meaningful standards, will allow us as a federal government to enforce a law.
Today, President Trump issued an executive order calling for accreditation standards for police departments, data sharing on police officers who use excessive force, and federal funding to help police respond to the homeless and mentally ill. Let me be clear, this is not enough. There is nothing about what the President announced today that would hold police officers who break the rules and break the law accountable.
Earlier in the day, President Trump signed an executive order on police accountability at the White House. Part of the measure establishes a national database to share information about police misconduct. For more, CBSN political contributor Molly Hooper joins me now. She's a veteran Capitol Hill reporter. Molly, it's nice to see you again. What were some of the major takeaways from that Senate Judiciary Committee hearing?
Well, if you look at what happened after everybody made their opening statements, which was unusual given that in most hearings, the chairman and the ranking member will give statements, but in this hearing in particular, Lindsey Graham allowed Cory Booker and Kamala Harris to have their own opening statements, sort of signaling that he knows that they are working on this issue and have been involved in the police reform bill that is going through the House right now. But essentially what was going on was that this hearing was about community relations and how to curtail police use of force, or at least to discuss ideas around how one would do that. And essentially in this first panel that lasted from 2:30 to 6 p.m., a lot longer than Lindsey Graham had anticipated, the consensus was there needs probably to be more police officers recruited from the communities in which the communities that they police. There needs to be more trust created with the individuals who are recruited. And really, there needs to be better missions, so to speak, in a lot of these police departments. But again, it's very difficult how you regulate that, given that there's some 18,000 police departments across the country.
And Molly, who were some of the people who testified, and what messages were they trying to convey?
Well, again, this really goes back to that issue of community relations and building trust between the police officers and the communities that they police. And so individuals that we heard from today, actually, we heard from several last week at the House Judiciary hearing, including Vanita Gupta, who used to be the head of the Civil Rights Division under President Obama, and also a gentleman named Dr. Phil Goff, who essentially calls all this data related to police use of force and all these various statistics related to policing, essentially, you could say. And the consensus, though, overall was that there needs to be a lot more information coming from police departments on this issue of use of force and the outcomes of that. And they also need more statistics on, which races are involved. Again, more data provided from these various police departments departments, sort of to get down to the nitty-gritty of how you can make some of these changes. But another major issue that was discussed, and which will be a big issue as the House and the Senate move through this process of creating reform, is the idea of qualified immunity, Elaine, as you reported at the top, that this idea that cops can't be sued because they're doing their jobs. Well, Republicans, like Tim Scott, who's taking the lead in the Senate, they don't like changing this idea of qualified immunity, as we heard Lindsey Graham say. Whereas Cory Booker says that's the key. Kamala Harris says this is the key. Police officers need to be accountable. They're not going to change behaviors until there's more accountability and consequences. So as we move forward with this debate over police reform, that will be one of the major issues that can either make or break what the House and Senate decide to send to the president.
Right, so you have the House legislation and you have Senate Republicans crafting legislation there, led by, as you point out, Senator Tim Scott. What do we know about the reforms that we could see in that plan? We know qualified immunity is something that Senator Scott himself said was a poison pill.
Well, that's true. And so I think that what's going to happen is, well, tomorrow Senator Scott will unveil his proposal. Unveil his proposal, and we'll get to see, like I said, more of the nitty gritty. But ideas like creating a national database to record the use of force that follows various police officers who engage in that. Also, this issue of limiting chokeholds, restricting federal funds to police departments who don't ban chokeholds, and some of these issues that we've been hearing Democrats discuss as well. And so we'll see that in the legislation. The question is, what will happen when and if that legislation gets to the Senate floor? And Mitch McConnell indicated earlier today that the Senate could take that bill up as soon as maybe next week or the week after, but really it depends on whether Democrats want to block it. The thing about the Senate, though, is that unlike the House, when the Senate does consider legislation, any senator can offer amendments. So once that legislation gets to the Senate chamber, that's when we'll see a debate over qualified immunity play out. But on the House side, tomorrow in the committee, the Judiciary Committee, all those details will get wrangled and worked out tomorrow, and then ultimately go to the House floor later this month. And at that point, it's up to conference, and we'll see whether these two chambers can come together and really enact some reforms that could spur more trust. And that, I think, is one message that we did hear during these panels. Trust and building relations in the communities, that's a very important factor in moving forward. And, if you don't trust the cops that are policing you, probably the outcomes aren't going to be so great.
Yeah. So with the House Democrats' proposal, the Justice in Policing Act, there has been some overlap, though, with what Republicans seem to be willing to support, Molly. Is that right? Is there some area, perhaps, of some common ground there, at least at first glance?
Well, yes, there really is. And, I'm looking down here at my notes because there are so many items packed into this bill. It's about 138 pages long, but really it ties federal funding to certain policies that the government would want to enact. Again, this idea of limiting funding, federal funds to police departments that don't ban chokeholds, and other issues like that. I mean, we could see movement on these matters, but really the sticking point, and this will be the issue to watch, is what happens with that idea of qualified immunity. Because while the federal government does want to have sort of a more uniform say over how police departments actually go out and police their communities, the question is, how do you really enforce that? Again, 18,000 police departments, and providing training to these various police departments is very important, but are those training standards uniform? And that's the question. But if you drill down into these bills, There is a lot of money for training, de-escalation tactics, increasing money for the Department of Justice Civil Rights Division to engage in patterns and practices investigations, something that has not been happening very much over the past 2 or 3 years. So again, with a renewed emphasis on and a spotlight on this issue, Democrats and Republicans have a lot of opportunity to agree and move something to the president. The question is, will the president accept it? And that, I think, is also a big unknown.
Right, very much an open question right now. Molly Hooper for us. Molly, good to see you, Molly. Thank you very much.